The estate loomed ahead as my car rolled to a stop, its facade obscured by a fine mist that clung stubbornly to the trees and gravel driveway. I sat there, taking in the scene. The towering structure was grand yet faded, an old-world relic lost in time, its once white walls yellowed and cracked. My friend had invited me for the weekend, a change of scenery, she'd said, her voice full of promise and mystery. As I stepped out and approached the door, a shiver crept up my spine. The air was oddly still, damp and heavy, pressing down on me. There was something almost oppressive about the quietness, as if the estate itself held its breath. But maybe it was just my imagination. My friend, Elise, greeted me at the door with a warm smile. She was radiant, looking as if she belonged to the estate more than I ever would. "I'm so glad you made it," she said, hugging me tightly. "You're going to love it here." I nodded, smiling back, but felt an inexplicable unease as I stepped inside. The hallway was dimly lit, the only light coming from flickering candelabras mounted on the walls, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The walls were lined with portraits of strangers from another time, some in suits, some in formal dresses, others in military uniforms. Each face seemed painted with an exquisite level of detail, down to the small imperfections and pores in their skin. But the eyes were what gave me pause. They were dark, intense, and strangely alive, each pair holding a gaze that seemed to peer directly into my own. I told myself it was just a trick of the light. After all, the flickering candles and shadows could create strange effects. But as I made my way down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder once or twice, feeling foolish, only to find Elise laughing gently at my discomfort. "I see you've noticed the portraits," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "They say they're the original owners of the estate. Generations of the family that built this place." "They're intense," I replied, forcing a smile. She nodded, almost knowingly. "It's just a part of the charm. You'll get used to it." I forced a laugh, hoping my unease didn't show. But as we continued down the hall, I felt those eyes on me, prickling the back of my neck. I could almost swear that one of them, a man in a high-collared suit, was watching me, his gaze shifting ever so slightly as I walked past. But when I looked back, he was as still as ever, his expression frozen in a solemn, almost melancholic stare. After settling in my room, I decided to explore a bit, hoping that wandering the estate would settle my nerves. Elise was preparing some things for dinner and encouraged me to look around, saying there was much to see. As I made my way through the corridors, I couldn't escape the feeling of those eyes following me. The portraits seemed strategically placed along every major hallway, as though to keep watch over every inch of the estate. I told myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But every once in a while, I'd catch a faint glimmer in one of the paintings, a glint that made the eyes seem almost alive. I paused in front of one of the larger portraits, a woman dressed in an elaborate gown, her dark hair pulled back into an intricate style. Her eyes seemed to hold a kind of sadness, but also a fierce, piercing intensity. It was the sort of gaze that made you feel as though you were being judged, as though she knew something about me that I didn't want to reveal. I shook my head, breaking away from her unsettling stare, and moved on, trying to ignore the gnawing sensation creeping up my spine. As I continued, strange noises echoed through the empty hallways, a faint creak here, the soft rustle of fabric there. Once or twice, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, only to turn around and find the corridor empty, the silence deepening with each passing moment. By evening, the feeling had settled into a constant presence, like a shadow clinging to my every move. I tried to focus on the meal, on Elisa's cheerful chatter, on the soft glow of the candles, but something was wrong. The portraits hung silently on the walls around us, seeming to form an audience of silent spectators, their eyes fixed upon us. After dinner, Elise excused herself, saying she needed to attend to something in the study. I decided to explore a bit more, hoping to shake off the feeling that had haunted me since I'd arrived. That's why I saw it. As I walked down the hallway toward my room, I caught sight of a small movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, heart pounding, and found myself facing one of the portraits, a young girl with a somber expression, her hands clasped in her lap. I stared at her, willing myself to breathe, to calm down, but then it happened again. Her eyes, dark and glassy, shifted slightly to the left, and for one fleeting moment, she blinked. My heart stopped. I stepped back, pressing myself against the opposite wall, not daring to take my eyes off her. The hallway was still, silent, the air thick with an almost unbearable weight. And yet, those eyes. They seemed to hold a spark of life, something just beneath the surface, as if she were studying me, assessing me. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. Nothing. Just silence, the stillness pressing down on me like a shroud. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the flickering candle at the end of the hallway, but the image of her blinking stayed with me. I could feel her gaze on me, even as I stumbled back to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the presence of those eyes in every corner of the room. I told myself it was all in my head, that the portraits were just paintings, mirror oil and canvas. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to them, something alive and watching, waiting. As I drifted into a fitful sleep, a final thought crossed: what if they aren't just paintings? I woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat, my pulse thrumming in my ears. It was still dark outside, with only a faint glow from the hallway spilling into my room. I lay there, trying to shake the sense of unease that lingered from last night. The blinking portrait, the girl with those dark, glassy eyes, had haunted my dreams, her gaze never leaving me as I wandered lost through endless, twisting hallways. I barely had any rest, but I knew I couldn't stay in bed. Something was pulling me to explore the estate further, as if answers lay hidden in its shadowed corners. When I stepped into the hallway, it felt colder than before, a sharp, biting chill that made my skin prickle. I glanced warily at the portraits lining the corridor. Their faces, which had unsettled me the night before, seemed even stranger in the dim light. As I passed by them, I felt an almost physical presence, a tension that pressed against me, urging me to look closer. Determined to ignore them, I moved toward a different wing of the estate. But with each step, I felt something off. It wasn't just the cold or the silence that seemed to deepen as I walked, it was the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts around me. I looked back, and that's when I noticed it, a painting of an elderly man near the end of the hallway. He was smiling faintly, his eyes shining with what could have been mischief or malice, but when I passed him and glanced over my shoulder, his expression had changed. His lips were now pressed into a grim frown, his eyes narrowed as though he were displeased by my presence. I blinked, unsure of what I was seeing. But when I looked again, his face was exactly as it had been, smiling and serene. I let out a shaky laugh, telling myself it was just my imagination, the shadows playing tricks on me. I moved on, but the feeling grew worse. As I ventured deeper into the house, I noticed other strange details, the faint sound of footsteps when no one else was around, the inexplicable chill that seemed to gather around certain portraits, the unsettling sensation of being watched. An hour later, I found myself in another hallway I hadn't explored before. It was lined with more portraits, though these were of younger faces, children and teenagers, all dressed in formal attire. They looked serious, too serious for their age, and there was something almost accusing in their expressions. I lingered in front of one, a boy no older than 12, with a shock of dark hair and intense eyes. He was staring straight ahead, lips pressed into a tight line. But as I leaned in, feeling an inexplicable pull, his expression seemed to shift. His mouth twisted slightly, as though forming a smirk, and his eyes, they glinted with something that looked like anger, or perhaps disdain. I stepped back, heart pounding, convinced it was just a trick of the light. And yet, there was no denying what I'd seen. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, echoing down the hallway. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was cold and accusing, like the voices of children scolding someone for a terrible misdeed. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the whispering faded, leaving only silence. I found Elise in the sitting room later that evening, preparing for dinner. She greeted me with a warm smile, her eyes sparkling with amusement as if she'd sensed my discomfort. "Is everything all right?" she asked, glancing at me over the rim of her teacup. I hesitated, wondering how much to tell her. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I couldn't shake the strange things I'd been noticing. I keep feeling like I'm being watched," I admitted. "The portraits, they almost seem alive." To my surprise, Elise laughed, though there was an edge to it, as if she were humoring me. "It's an old house," she said. "It has its quirks. But I assure you, the portraits are just paintings. Nothing more." Her answer seemed too rehearsed, too dismissive, and it only deepened my suspicion. "It's not just that," I pressed. "I keep seeing changes in their faces. Smiles turning to frowns, expressions shifting. It's like they're watching me." Elise's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, a look of concern, or perhaps fear. But she quickly masked it, brushing off my words with a wave of her hand. "You're just imagining things," she said lightly. "Old portraits can play tricks on the eyes, especially in dim lighting. Don't let it get to you." But her tone was evasive, and it only made me more certain that something was wrong. I wanted to ask more, to press her for answers, but she had already turned away, busying herself with dinner preparations as though our conversation hadn't happened. That night, I decided to test my suspicions. If the portraits truly were just paintings, then there should be nothing to fear. I made my way to the main hallway, feeling the chill intensify as I passed the rows of faces. I lingered in front of each one, studying their expressions carefully, memorizing every detail. But as I moved on to the next portrait, I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. I turned, heart hammering, and saw that one of the portraits, a young woman with dark, sad eyes, had shifted ever so slightly on the wall, as though someone had nudged it. I stepped closer, reaching out to steady it, but the moment my fingers brushed the frame, a sharp, icy sensation shot through me, forcing me to pull my hand back. The air grew colder, and I felt a prickling on the back of my neck. The portraits around me seemed to lean forward, their eyes narrowing, their expressions shifting ever so subtly. I could see it now, the hints of smirks, but barely their frowns, the glint of something malicious in their gazes. It was as if they were aware of me, watching my every move, and I felt a creeping dread settle over me. I took a step back, nearly tripping over something behind me. Looking down, I saw an antique clock lying on its side, its hands frozen at midnight. I could have sworn it hadn't been there before, and the realization sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through me. Someone, or something, was moving things in the hallway, rearranging objects just out of sight, leaving traces of their presence like ghostly fingerprints. By the time I returned to my room, my nerves were frayed. I locked the door, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The shifting portraits, the icy cold, the whispers, it was all too much. I could no longer convince myself it was just my imagination. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the old house settling, each creak and groan amplified in the darkness. At one point, I heard a soft scraping noise just outside my door, like fingernails dragging along the wood. My heart thundered as I held my breath, straining to hear, but the noise faded, leaving me in silence once more. In the early hours of the morning, I finally drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by visions of those cold, accusing eyes. The next day, I confronted Elise again, determined to get answers. I found her in the study, going through a stack of old letters. "Elise, I need you to tell me what's really going on here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's something wrong with this place. The portraits, they're not just paintings, are they?" Elise looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You're letting the house get to you," she said softly. "I warned you, it has a way of playing tricks on the mind. But I assure you, it's all in your head." Her words felt hollow, insincere, and I could see the fear flickering in her eyes. She knew more than she was letting on, but she wasn't going to tell me. Not yet. As I left the study, I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of her standing there, watching me with a strange, almost pitying expression. It was as if she knew something I didn't, as if she were waiting for me to discover the truth on my own. I spent the next day poring over every inch of the house I could access, determined to find out what was really going on here. The cryptic smiles and shifting eyes in the portraits haunted me, and the evasive way Elise dismissed my questions only fueled my suspicion. There was something dark in this house, something everyone but me seemed intent on keeping hidden. The first step was to dig into the house's history, and as luck would have it, I found exactly what I needed. In a dusty room near the back of the estate, behind stacks of books and half-shredded boxes, I found what looked like a collection of journals and letters, records of past residents, scattered fragments of lives long gone. I sat there for hours, flipping through the brittle pages, a mix of curiosity and dread twisting in my stomach. Most of it seemed innocent enough, notes on family gatherings, estate renovations, even shopping lists. But then I came across the strange entries, journal pages filled with eerie observations, almost warnings about certain limbs in the house and the portraits. There were mentions of the same chilling presence I had felt. One entry described a guest who swore they saw portraits' expression change overnight. Another talked about an unnerving encounter where a portrait of a young girl was seen in different parts of the hallway, as if it had moved of its own accord. Then I found something that made my blood run cold, a single page, torn and stained, detailing a story about a guest who vanished after spending the night in the very room I was sleeping in. According to the writer, the guest had woken up in the dead of night, claiming that one of the portraits, a young woman with piercing, sorrowful eyes, had somehow followed her movements around the house. The guest left the next morning, saying she was done with the place. But no one ever heard from her again. There were other entries too, about strange illnesses, visitors who seemed to lose their minds, even reports of violent accidents within the house. The common thread was always the same, the portraits. Each account mentioned a particular face on the wall, a face that seemed to hold more than just paint and canvas. I started to suspect what I'd been dreading. Maybe the portraits weren't just paintings. Maybe each one of them held something, or someone. My heart pounded as I realized the horrifying possibility. These weren't just random faces. They were guests, family members, even servants who had lived here, trapped in their last expressions as the house claimed them. Somehow, they had become part of the house, a dark gallery of souls watching every move of those unlucky enough to walk these halls. That night, exhausted but determined, I returned to my room. The house seemed to grow colder as the sun set, and every shadow in the hallway felt thicker, somehow more aware of me. I could feel the eyes of the portraits on my back as I walked, their expressions shifting ever so slightly in the dim light. The oppressive silence closed in around me, like I was being smothered by the house itself. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for what felt like hours, the weight of the house's secrets pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful, troubled sleep. My dreams were vivid, more like memories that weren't my own. I was walking through the estate, but it was different, furnished in a way I didn't recognize, with dark mahogany walls and heavy curtains blocking out any light. I saw the faces from the portraits, alive and animated, speaking in soft whispers to one another. They moved around the house, their footsteps echoing softly in the empty rooms. One by one, they turned to look at me, their eyes cold and knowing, as if they'd been expecting me. A woman with sunken eyes and a tight-lipped smile stepped forward, her expression morphing from a serene smile to a grim frown as she fixed her gaze on me. I tried to turn away, but her eyes held me in place. Then she opened her mouth, and her words poured out like venom. This house takes what it pleases. It never lets go. I jerked awake, gasping, my heart pounding in my chest. My mouth was dry, my limbs stiff with fear, and the room was cloaked in darkness. For a moment, I lay still, trying to shake the lingering dread that clung to me, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the portraits from the hallway, the young woman with the sorrowful eyes I'd read about, was no longer in her usual place. I remembered her position exactly, as she'd been one of the first faces I'd studied. But now, she was gone. I quickly sat up, my heart racing, dread pooling in my stomach. Slowly, I turned my head toward the doorway. There she was, her frame angled just right so she could peer directly into my room from the hallway. Her eyes, those haunting, sorrowful eyes, stared straight at me, as though she were waiting, watching. A wave of panic surged through me. I scrambled out of bed and slammed the door shut, leaning against it as I tried to steady my breathing. This couldn't be real. None of this could be real. But the cold, lingering feeling of her gaze was undeniable, and I knew that something terrible was hiding behind those painted eyes. The next morning, I confronted Elise. She had to know what was going on. She was evasive, dodging my questions with that same dismissive tone, but I saw the nervous flicker in her eyes. She couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer. Elise, I know the history of this house, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. I know about the guests who disappeared, the accidents, the strange illnesses. This isn't just some old house with quirks. There's something more, something dark. The portraits, they're not normal, are they? For a moment, she looked like she was going to deny it again. But then, her shoulders slumped, and she let out a weary sigh. This house, it has a way of keeping people here, she said quietly. Those who stay too long become part of it, in one way or another. Some become the house itself, watching over it, trapped in the frames. Her words sent a chill down my spine, confirming what I had feared all along. The portraits weren't just paintings, they were vessels, prisons for the souls of those who had been taken by the house. Each face in the hallway was a person, someone who had once walked these halls just as I was now. Why didn't you warn me? I demanded, a mixture of anger and desperation in my voice. Elise looked away, guilt shadowing her face. I thought maybe you'd be different. That maybe the house would let you go. She paused, her eyes full of regret. But it seems the house has already made up its mind. I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the portrait stairs, and I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave, to escape this place before it claimed me too. But as I packed my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. That night, I lay in bed, my eyes fixed on the closed door. Every creak and groan of the house sounded louder, more sinister, and I could feel the presence of the portraits just outside my room, waiting, watching. I was certain they would come for me eventually, that the house would find a way to keep me here, to add my face to its gallery of trapped souls. In a moment of desperation, I considered smashing the portraits, breaking their frames to see if that would release the souls within. But something held me back, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispering that it wouldn't help. That the house would only grow angrier, its hunger more intense. So I lay there, helpless, haunted by the eyes in the dark, feeling the weight of centuries of suffering pressing down on me. I could only hope that when the time came, I'd be able to resist the pull of the house, to fight against its insidious grasp. But as I drifted into a restless sleep, I knew that escape was unlikely. The house had claimed many before me, and I was just one more face, one more soul to be added to its haunted gallery. I couldn't stay here any longer. The house was breathing down my neck, and every corner felt like it had something waiting to reach out and pull me in. Elise's words echoed in my mind, but her evasive nature, her reluctance to help me, only strengthened my resolve. She knew too much, had probably witnessed too much, and as much as I feared the consequences, I needed to confront whatever horror was tethered to the portraits and put an end to it before the house added me to its morbid gallery. I returned to the dusty room where I'd found the letters and journals, flipping through the pages with shaky hands. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, some sort of explanation, a solution, anything that would tell me how to sever the house's grip. Then, I came across a single page near the bottom of the pile. The words, penned in rushed strokes, seemed different from the rest. It was a letter written by a previous guest who had tried to escape the same malevolent force. She detailed a ritual, one she had almost completed before she, too, disappeared. According to her letter, the ritual was a binding spell of sorts, one that could sever the connection between the house and the trapped souls. But the price, she warned, was high. I might release the souls, yes, but I would also risk becoming a part of the house myself, bound to its darkness forever if I failed. Despite the risk, I knew I had no choice. It was either take the gamble or remain here, helplessly awaiting whatever fate had taken the others. I quickly gathered a few items from around the house as instructed, an old candle, a piece of silverware from the kitchen, and a piece of wood chipped from the base of one of the portraits. With these items, I was supposed to begin the ritual in the hallway where the portraits hung, which the letter referred to as the house's true heart. As I made my way back to the hallway, the house seemed to grow colder, heavier. The air around me thickened, and every creak of the floorboards felt intentional, like the house itself was aware of what I planned to do. I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a threat, but I pressed on, determined to see this through. Standing in the center of the hallway, I lit the candle, casting flickering shadows across the portraits. Their faces appeared darker, more hollow, and I could feel their eyes on me, following every movement as I laid out the other objects. Then, with a trembling breath, I began reading the incantation scrawled in the letter, the words foreign and ancient, heavy with meaning even if I didn't fully understand them. Almost immediately, the air shifted. A faint tremor vibrated through the floor beneath me, rattling the frames on the walls. The candle's flame sputtered, casting erratic shadows, and the expressions on the portraits began to twist, distorting in ways that defied reason. Faces once frozen in solemn dignity now looked horrified, mouths twisted open in silent screams, eyes bulging in fear and fury. A low, guttural sound filled the hallway, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The whole house was shaking now, each tremor more violent than the last, and I struggled to keep my balance as I chanted the words. The portraits continued to change, their expressions contorting into grotesque shapes, as if they were fighting against whatever I was trying to do. But I knew I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I'd be leaving myself and the souls trapped in the house at the mercy of this malevolent force. So I pressed on, shouting the words over the mounting noise, feeling a surge of defiance and terror with each verse. Suddenly, shadows began to seep from the edges of the portraits, wisps of darkness curling and coalescing into vaguely human shapes. These shadowed figures swayed and writhed, their outlines indistinct, like smoke given form. Their mouths opened in silent, agonized screams as they reached toward me, their hands clawing the air in desperation. They wanted freedom, I realized. These were the souls of those trapped in the portraits, bound to the house for decades, centuries. But their anger was palpable, their fury directed as much at me as it was at the house itself. I could feel the weight of their suffering, their desperation, and it threatened to crush me. But I kept chanting, forcing myself to hold steady against the invisible pressure that pushed back against me. Then, just as I reached the final verse, I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the chaos with chilling clarity. It was Elise. "Stop," she shouted, her voice echoing down the hallway. "You don't know what you're doing. If you finish that ritual, you'll unleash something you can't control." Her voice wavered, a mixture of anger and fear, but I couldn't stop now. Not while I was so close. I looked at her, her face pale and desperate, and for a moment, I hesitated. But then I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, of something hidden. She knew more than she was letting on, I realized. She had known all along. "What are you telling me?" I shouted over the din, my voice raw with frustration. "Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Elise took a step forward, her face twisted with an emotion I couldn't read. Because some things are better left buried. You're tampering with forces that don't forgive, forces that will take anyone who tries to defy them. This house, it doesn't let go. The words sent a chill through me, but I couldn't stop. I knew this was my only chance, no matter the risk. With a final, defiant shout, I finished the incantation, pouring every ounce of strength I had into the last words. The hallway went deathly silent. For a moment, nothing happened. The candle flickered one last time before going out, plunging the hallway into darkness. I could feel Elise's gaze on me, sharp and cold, but I couldn't see her face. I couldn't see anything at all. Then, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard filled the air, a scream, raw and agonized, echoing from within the walls. It was as if every soul trapped in the portraits was crying out at once, a collective wail of anguish and release. The shadows began to writhe, twisting and stretching as they were pulled back into the walls, feeding into the darkness one by one. I thought I had done it. I thought I had freed them. But then, I felt a cold, crushing weight press down on me, like an invisible hand gripping my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The walls seemed to close in around me, the portraits' faces melting into dark, twisted shapes that watched with cruel satisfaction as I struggled. And then I heard the voice again, Elise, but different, deeper, almost inhuman. "You thought you could defy this house?" the voice sneered. "You are no savior. You are just another soul, another face for the walls." My vision blurred as the weight on my chest grew heavier, the world slipping away as darkness closed in around me. The last thing I saw was Elisa's face, her expression a twisted mixture of pity and satisfaction. When I woke, the house was silent. The hallway was empty, the portrait still and lifeless once more. But as I staggered to my feet, I felt a cold chill settle over me, a familiar weight that I couldn't shake. I looked around, and that's when I saw it, a new portrait on the wall. My own face stared back at me, frozen in a look of horror, trapped in the same eternal gaze that had haunted me from the moment I arrived. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was a part of the house now, a prisoner in its dark gallery, condemned to watch as others, like me, would come, would hope, and would fail, just as I had. The house had claimed me, and I knew that there would be no escape. I was just another face on the wall. The ritual ended with a deafening silence. The candle flickered one last time before sputtering out, and in the sudden darkness, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the only sound left in the void. I strained to hear any sign of movement, to sense any change around me, but there was nothing. The oppressive energy that had filled the hallway just moments ago had vanished, leaving only an eerie calm in its wake. Taking a shaky breath, I peered at the portraits, half expecting to see those tormented faces again, staring back at me with fury or pleading for release. But to my surprise and confusion, the portraits were blank. The frames, once so heavy with malevolent presence, now held only blank canvases, empty and lifeless. The hallway itself seemed duller, stripped of the sinister vitality it once had. Had it worked? Had I actually freed them? For a brief, foolish moment, I felt relief. I turned to look for Elise, to see if she, too, had been set free by the ritual, or if perhaps the house had merely been an illusion all along. But before I could even take a step, I felt it, a cold, creeping sensation that prickled up my spine, a silent warning that I wasn't alone. A faint rustle sounded behind me, and I turned, slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. There, in the shadows, figures began to emerge, one by one, materializing out of the darkness like phantoms. Each face was eerily familiar, hauntingly so, the very people I had seen in the portraits, now standing before me in the flesh, their eyes gleaming with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. They advanced silently, surrounding me, their expressions twisted in a grim mixture of vengeance and suffering. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor, my body frozen as they closed in, their eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding hunger. It was as if they could sense my fear, feeding off it, drawing closer until I could feel their cold breaths against my skin. And then, in a horrible, shattering moment of clarity, the truth dawned on me. I hadn't freed them. The ritual hadn't severed their ties to this place, it had merely shifted the curse, transferred it. I had been the final piece, the one who would take their place, the newest addition to the cursed gallery. "No, please," I whispered, but the words died on my lips, swallowed by the unfeeling darkness. As they reached out, their fingers ice cold as they grasped my arms, my shoulders, I felt a pulling sensation, a relentless tug that seemed to draw something out of me. It was as though my very spirit was being wrenched from my body, leaving only an empty shell behind. The world around me blurred, my vision fading until all I could see was a dark, swirling void. My last conscious thought was a desperate plea, a scream that echoed in the depths of my mind, unanswered and unheard. Then, suddenly, I could see again, but not from my own eyes. My vision was strangely flat, two-dimensional, confined. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only watch, helpless and silent, as the hallway came back into focus around me. But now, I was on the wall, a part of the very fabric of the house. I was one of the portraits, my face frozen in a look of terror, trapped for eternity in the place I had so desperately tried to escape. And as the hours passed, as I stared out from the cold prison of my frame, a shadow moved at the far end of the hallway. A figure, a new guest, eyes wide with curiosity, stepped into view, glancing around at the opulent decor, the blank, waiting portraits. They had no idea what awaited them. They couldn't see us, couldn't hear the silent screams of those who had come before. But I could see them. And I knew that when the time came, they, too, would be trapped here, another soul added to the house's collection. As the guest approached, I felt a shift within me, an instinct I couldn't control. My eyes followed their every step, unblinking, unrelenting, a prisoner forced to watch helplessly, forever. The house had claimed me. And now, I was just another set of eyes in the wall, waiting for the next poor soul to join us.